Hi and welcome to BroPod, where we talk to those that defy convention from the worlds of sports, media, finance, and politics. It's been a long time since we've had our last episode, but a lot has changed since we had that 44th episode, I believe, or 45th. I'm not sure. I'll have to check. But beyond that doesn't matter because it's a big day for BroPod. After doing our last episode where we did it away from each other, we said goodbye as partners, I would say. It got even tougher and it became even more conclusive, our split, because Ciaran, you are now show the ring. Look at that. Oh, married man. Oh, yeah. My God. Oh my God.
Yeah. Listen, the best way to mend a broken heart is to just get right back into a new love. So you left me and I had to move on.
That's a nice way to put it. That's a nice way to put it. But it was a fantastic wedding. We've obviously reflected on. We will not use this platform to expand even further. But all there needs to be said is it was a fantastic wedding, a fantastic ceremony, and it's an outstanding bride, must be said. So incredible. Very nice.
One of us married, one of us retired. So
unofficially, keeping all options open, my friend. So we'll see. But I think this heavy body is on its last legs. Is that what you say?
Maybe.
So unfortunately, I will not bless Scottish football anymore, or to the maybe for the bliss of others, depending on who you ask. But it's been a ride in Scotland. It's been a very nice ride, but all good things must come to an end. But Scotland for 3 years, man. We lived together for 3 years. Mm-hmm. How it all came together for us, and the story we've had, and long may it continue, obviously. This being one of them, but it was a fantastic 3 years with a lot of ups and a lot of downs. We can say that much.
Brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. And what better way than to have another guest on? I think that's our therapy and our celebration, so to speak. I'm checking now while you'll speak. I'll check while our episode is downloading.
Yeah. Instead of saying, instead of admitting that we're missing each other, we just get another episode in.
Exactly. And like any other healthy male, we just go in denial. So now that I've concluded that our episode has actually been downloaded, so that wasn't all in vain, I guess we can present our guest, Ciaran, because we have Colin Millar on, who we came across on Twitter, a journalist, a football writer, who is, for us, rather enjoyable on Twitter in the sense that he's able to rather succinctly contextualize the different things that go around the world, especially when in the sports world. And in our approach to this episode here, we were going back and forth in terms of how we wanted to approach it. Mm-hmm. And I guess you can talk us through what we were thinking with a guest like Colin.
Mm-hmm. It's just, it's no surprise that obviously we are very engaged and passionate about sport, football, all sides of it, and politics. And we would always be talking about everything going on, and time after time I'd find, we would find on Twitter coming across Colin's kind of tweets and threads, and he, like you said, very good at contextualising and summing up and giving a very honest, objective kind of overview of everything. And it's kind of on all, issues across the board. So we picked a handful that we felt were relevant and we're most curious about. And it ranged from, Spanish football culture, La Liga, financial regulations there, how that's comparing to other European leagues who are, expressing the same interest and passion to do more in financial regulation, but not actually doing anything about it. We then spoke about the kind of woke capitalism, which has been, pretty present for the last maybe.
And explain what that is and why that was relevant for the sports dimension of it.
I think we've obviously seen it increasingly recently, and now it's really getting plainly obvious in sport. But the best way to sum it up is when these corporations or clubs feel like they need to take a stance on everything, even when it's completely unrelated to their business and and what they do, and it's to maybe buy them some social capital, buy them some goodwill, paint themselves as progressive, but simultaneously their ownership systems, their commercial dealings, often standing, direct hypocrisy with these kind of values that they say they're champion. And there's obviously been arguments, and Colin touched on it. This has always kind of been, present. It's a murky world of business, a murky world of sport, and it's money and profits and success kind of defeats all. But it seems like we're at a stage where it's just like slap in the face.
Mm-hmm.
You don't care, and it's almost like a simulation at times when you see the new Saudi ownership, the sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia buying over Newcastle, a state which pretty much outlaws homosexuality. Then Newcastle tweeting, I'm pretty sure it was Newcastle, tweeting congratulations to Jake Daniels and coming out, the young Blackpool player, and they're just kind of like genuinely feeling like you're in a simulation.
Yeah.
So like we said, we see all these things. Colin speaks very well on them, and we thought we'd just get in and explore them. And did we get into some, real?
It gets this is no like this is in serious engagement with pretty complex issues, similar to the way Colin is negotiating or trying to deliberate upon these issues. So do we. We are not coming up with a magical solution here. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that it is murky, it's obscure, it's messy, the whole thing. Messi incidentally being mentioned, poor joke, I realize that. Moving on. And we are not trying to take a moral superior position here. I think it's just important to explore it and discuss it, because it informs hopefully the audience we have, but two, it's also a way for us to try to articulate what is around us. And I understand it's difficult for us. I don't see, for example, football players as culpable as the ones that are in the front office. I think players make certain decisions, right? And it will be merely football related. And should they use that as an excuse? I think that's acceptable for players to do that. And I don't think they should be as liable, nor should fans be. I think they are more so a symptom or a consequence of the decisions being made at the very top. So I understand there are such nuances within this, right? But so it is tough. But it's invalid when La Liga make a complaint to PSG about PSG to UEFA, and they report some losses here that are, out. Like Colin mentioned in the pod, is you become, you don't have any relationship to these numbers, but there's so much, they've lost so much money, right? And then it doesn't really matter, right? It's just like, oh, there's so much debt, and obviously that's. In this case, it's a state-run ownership where it kind of inflates the market, and so it is. So then his question is it better to be unregulated and then let the money free flow? Well, for these clubs, it might be because they can carry those losses. For most clubs, they can't. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot to undertake. We wish we could have touched upon more, but we keep our restriction an hour. And so we, I guess it's all for us to crack on with this episode, and we'd love to hear what other people think as well, because we have gathered more knowledge, but we are none the wiser in that sense about what to do. That's the way it is. Exactly. Should we just let them? Yeah, go ahead.
Crack on. All I was going to say is you hit the nail on the head in terms of we are just exploring, and we don't necessarily have the answers or the solutions, and there is definitely a overwhelming feeling of helplessness, but the start is to be informed, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here. and there was no better man than Colin on a lot of these issues to help inform us and dive into them.
Exactly. We'll let you guys finally listen to other voices than ourselves for the most part. So join us after the break for our chats with Colin Millar. We are delighted to welcome Colin Millar on the show. And Colin, we have presented you in our intro, and you are obviously a journalist, a football writer, and you also written a book on one of the hottest rivalries in sports or in football between Sevilla and Real Betis. And I'd like to go off that and start off with the La Liga. And I saw we were stalking our guest Twitters as we do, and you have some incredibly good content and why we wanted to have you on the show. But then I saw that La Liga has the least minutes played of the 90 minutes. They have the least goals scored and the most yellows of the top 5 leagues. What does this say about La Liga and with regards to where it was and what it's now like and where it is headed?
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? I sort of stumbled upon that, and it's been something that has been sort of known about for a while. This sort of change in Spanish football, the playing culture, because I think people who don't watch Spanish football have this sort of idea, this sort of it's all tiki-taka. It's all like these teams who are based off of sort of Pep Guardiola things and like sort of miniature versions of that. And these are teams who don't like physical confrontation. They don't really play with any intensity, and it's just all sort of ball possession. And it couldn't be further from the truth the way things are at the minute. La Liga matches are intense. They're very physical. Teams are very streetwise, which I think has always been the case. But there is a high level of cynicism, I think, within the teams of La Liga. I think maybe a key reason for that has been the success of Diego Simeone and Atletico Madrid, whereby you have a team and a club who weren't Real Madrid and weren't Barcelona, didn't have those resources, weren't able to play the way they did, but sort of created this own identity of their own, whereby in Spanish they have this verb to suffer, and it's like this, it's seen as this great positive for a team. If you can suffer in a match, you know how to withstand attacks, you know how to absorb pressure, and then you know how to hurt your opponent in those sort of key moments, and it matters. And I think in a very basic sense, that's what a lot of teams have based themselves off. And I mean, I remember when Rafael Varane signed for Manchester United a year ago. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Rio Ferdinand said, Varane's a wonderful defender, but he's going to have to learn how to defend against crosses in the Premier League. And I was like, there's no way there can be that much of a difference in reality. And I looked it up, and it was actually Real Madrid had faced more crosses in La Liga than United had in the Premier League. I think there's a variety of reasons behind that. Obviously, the Premier League has this influx of coaches from all around the world, whereas if you look at La Liga, 17 or 18, if not more, of those managers and coaching staff are predominantly Spanish. So they're all coming from a sort of similar school of thought, whereas the Premier League is always evolving in terms of the styles of play. They're successful, and so that would obviously Jurgen Klopp, Pep Guardiola coming in, all these different influences. But Spain's been a bit more streamlined. And again, it's interesting to see the fact that despite that sounds like a pejorative. That sounds like this is a league that's struggling, yet they still managed to pull off results in European football. We look at what Villarreal did this season, obviously won in the Europa League the season before that. Sevilla's successes over the years. We always have these Spanish clubs who are, quote mark smaller clubs, but doing exceptionally well, punching above their weight. Maybe that's just because, in the sense that maybe what they do just has a particular effect within European football that isn't present in the Premier League or in the Bundesliga, where teams are very well organised, very well structured. And you can see the coaching that has an effect on the players. Like all the players know exactly what their job is within the team, and that helps in those types of games. I'm not 100% sure, but yes, Spanish football's gone through changes on and off the pitch, certainly in the past number of years. And yeah, I mean, those are problems. You know, you don't want to be the league that has the most yellow cards. You don't want to be the league that has the least in play time. Yet the reverse of that is, you know, that's the predominant coaching style at the minute. But these things always evolve. It'll evolve back again. It'll just be interesting to see how quickly that takes.
Mm-hmm. Well, in attempts to modernize the league, so to speak, or at least, the very least, bring it on a path to more sustainable growth, there has been a deal in principle agreed with the CVC, the private equity firm, right, for them to buy a 10% stake of their commercial rights, which has faced a bit of backlash from Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Bilbao, who have countered that with their own project sustainability. But this is essentially an attempt to rebuild these teams' fraught business models, right? Over the last years, Barcelona perfectly exemplified by that in the way they've had to get rid of players, most notably in Messi. Now, the La Liga president Javier Tebas, he wants to instigate change for the better, of course. But how do you see these? Because there are certain spending controls being initiated. There are certain loans being given to these clubs that they have to repay, but they have nothing to do with player recruitment. It's more so in terms of improving the overall infrastructure. Is this a sign of what should be to come, or something that UEFA should instigate? Or is it, as a matter of fact, actually hindering growth? How do you see that, Colin?
In terms of the CVC deal, it's something that, and all these financial deals, which include loans and certain periods of time to pay it back, and you're selling off essentially part of your own growth for this sort of short-term injection of cash, it's difficult to really get your head around the full implications either way. I think that's difficult for anyone who doesn't really have that financial background, and it's certainly true for me. But what I would say is that I'm suspicious of that, in the sense that, as you sort of alluded to there, this is a deal that naturally hinders long-term growth. This is a deal that ties the club to the fortunes of the league, yet has essentially sold off a percentage of what it can earn for this lump sum payment. Now, of course, it seems to be a beneficial point of this, that, you know, this is going to be going into facilities, this is going to be going into the clubs to make themselves sustainable. And you could argue, of course, that this gives them the breathing space to get their structures right, which allows them to sort of build more finance, to get more investment, and then to sort of write off the losses that they'll have in this deal. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. In terms of La Liga's sort of spending controls, I think this is generally a big positive, but with caveats. Like everything in this will have caveats, because La Liga, essentially, Spanish clubs in 2007, 2008, after the financial crash, a lot of their funding and a lot of their creditors was tied up with the banks. And whenever the banks collapsed, these clubs, multiple big clubs, and you think in Real Zaragoza, you think in Deportivo La Coruña, two clubs who essentially should be, you know, by their sort of natural size, should be competing in Europe, yet are now languishing in the lower divisions, coming within the brink of financial ruin. The same is true of Valencia, the same is true of Real Betis, and multiple other clubs who are on a similar par. They were clubs who essentially were not run with a long-term view in mind, and they were part of the Spanish football structure, which I think structurally has historically benefited Barcelona and Real Madrid, because those are the two big clubs. Those are the two clubs that can really sort of transcend Spanish football. And I think for a long time, prior to the Javier Tebas administration coming in La Liga, Spanish football and La Liga and Spanish FA prioritized the growth of those major clubs at the expense, I think, of the rest. Right. And essentially, they were marketing themselves on Madrid, Barcelona, El Clasico, Messi, Ronaldo. Yeah, all the other clubs were struggling. And that is something that has been holding Spanish football back for a long time. And I think that Tebas, he's a character who is not without his drawbacks, so to speak, in terms of how I think he views football, and how his approach to things isn't always beneficial. But I think in this sense, La Liga have got it right, because what La Liga have done is to think, right, a lot of these clubs, especially those clubs, a lot of clubs like Girona and like Eibar, who sort of come into the top flight in recent years, you know, these are clubs who only get 5,000 or 6,000 fans on a match day. I mean, this would be less than a lot of clubs in the Scottish top flight would get. Mm-hmm. So this is a case whereby these clubs don't really have the infrastructure to grow naturally quickly enough to make themselves competitive at that level. So what La Liga did was, it was like, right, what we're going to do, our approach is going to be this umbrella term whereby all the clubs are going to be under us, and we're going to sort of negotiate on their behalf for the betterment of these clubs and sort of dry everybody up as a whole, so to speak. And again, you can question that in individual cases, but I think a lot of clubs are supportive of it. I think most fans are supportive of it. But again, you have the questions of Lionel Messi left Barcelona last summer, and Barcelona have been a basket case financially for years. They were allowed to run up over a billion euros in debt. A lot of that was short-term debt, so it wasn't just, that's the sort of debt levels that Tottenham Hotspur are in, but it's financed over 20 or 30 years. Barcelona's was to be repaid within the next 2 or 3 seasons, and it just couldn't do that. It was being run without any thought process. So there is the argument that those structures are needed for clubs to become financially sustainable, and the counter argument to that would be, well, is it holding them back financially? And you kind of think it's holding them back from spending more, but it would be spending more money that they can't sustain, that they can't control in the long term, and that would be a damaging way to run a club. I think if you're looking at why La Liga or Serie A or the Bundesliga or Liga, probably the best examples compared to the Premier League, it's because of the TV deal. The Premier League essentially has a TV deal that blows the rest out of the water, so all the Premier League clubs have income streams that nobody else, bar clubs who are essentially backed by nation states, can match. So you have a situation whereby clubs, and this is just off the top of my head, a club like Aston Villa, who finished 13th or 14th in the Premier League, all of a sudden becomes an attractable destination for a star of Sevilla, or a primary transfer target of Atletico Madrid, because they can afford to do it. They can afford to attract these players here. They can afford to do the transfer fees, the wages, and everything else. So again, the Premier League is in its own bubble. Is that sustainable? Again, it's difficult to say, but at the minute, that's where football finds itself, and La Liga is desperate to sort of pull itself up to the Premier League level. Although obviously that isn't something that in the short term is going to happen economically.
No, but it is a predicament in sorts, because in many ways, La Liga they filed a complaint over the Mbappe transfer. Mbappe, who signed an insane contract for PSG in Liga, calling it scandalous and calling for effort to do more, which I agree, because the FIFA financial fair play rules went out the window. There is none. And some might say that La Liga spending controls are going beyond that. But it is a valid predicament, because I think in theory and idea, it's very good. I would be curious to see how it goes long term. Granted, it needs given time. But then also they will say, likes of Javier Tebas will be more attractive for broadcasters. But of course, you put those regulations in and make it harder for the smaller teams to be competitive, as it restricts the way they can acquire players. If you don't have the star power, you don't necessarily have the leverage towards these broadcasters either, right? So it's a tough one, and all the dynamics that go into it, to see how it goes, because ultimately this needs to be given time, and in a very short term minded business, it would be curious how that unfolds.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a really good point, because whenever Lionel Messi switched Barcelona for PSG, all of a sudden you had this spike in interest in Liga. So not because of Liga, not because of the other clubs, but because of Messi, because of PSG, because of the sort of star attraction, and even the line of work that I work in. I work in online media, and knowing what sort of stories resonate with internet audiences, with the sort of fandom, maybe fans who are aged anywhere between their teenage years and their mid-30s, and it's not clubs, it's not individual matches, it's the star names, it's the player names, and I think that's something that has really increased in football in recent years. I think this is like a phenomenon you kind of get a little bit from American sports, especially the NBA, even the language of the MVP of this team. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, because basketball is 5 players a team, and these stars who just make the difference in a game. Football is much more team dynamic. But even setting that aside, that is essentially what you were saying is the counterpoint to La Liga, is that if you can't attract the star players, you're not going to get the widespread attention. And I think that's true to an extent. The opposite way of looking at this is that whenever PSG signed Messi, they had obviously that summer signed Sergio Ramos, Donnarumma, Wijnaldum, Mendes, Ashraf Hakimi, just this ridiculous cast of almost superstar players, and then also you already have Mbappe and Neymar. The season before they signed Messi, that season, the PSG wage bill as a club exceeded that of the bottom 14 teams in Liga combined. So they essentially had a wage bill that was more than 14 other clubs in their own league. Mm-hmm. That was before they signed the highest earning player in world football, before they signed Ramos and all the rest. And you kind of think there has always been this inequality in football, but there has never been such a barbaric level of difference. And you kind of think that, well, that's one thing. But you just said there that, PSG are running up these huge losses, these huge debts. But it's like it doesn't really matter. Like none of this stuff seems to matter. Like as an average fan, you kind of look at this and be like, well, there isn't, financial fair play doesn't really exist. It exists in La Liga because they enforce it within their own league structures in terms of registered players, but it doesn't exist anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you're talking about sustainability. Is this going to be something that the sort of further down the line is going to come back and bite these clubs or these leagues who don't enforce that? And at the end of the day, people be interested in Messi, people be interested in PSG, but I mean, Messi's 34 years old. I mean, how much longer is he going to be around? He's got another year in Paris. What will happen after that? What will happen whenever he leaves? Will those fans still be there? What's the sort of implications and the sort of long-term effect of that? And even last year, I mean, PSG just, you kind of think, they're having a bit of a rough patch of results. And then you look at the league table, it's like, they're 15 or 16 points clear, and their fans are miserable. Their fans are absolutely miserable, them walking away with the league. And so I think, well,
yeah, well, you can't build culture. You can't build culture, right? I mean, you cannot buy yourself towards it, right? And that's the problem. But when money becomes the objective good in the eyes of because fans want success and stuff, and then there's an interesting case here: will fans be too bored by that? But in a world where we salute those who have money and we castigate those who don't, and that becomes the overriding principle, and we do not care where the money basically comes from. For that's what it seems for me. Because when I see these clubs and a matter of Newcastle or there are certain clubs that are espousing certain values or being criticized, it seems as if they just expect us to forget, perhaps. For example, in the case of human rights, or given time enough, the fans will come around, because ultimately what they care about is the game. It's hard to negotiate all those different ideas or approaches, because that's what the impression I get. Fans say, we can get away with it given time enough.
Yeah, and there's two sort of conflicting ideas here. The first is that, a lot of people would argue, well, football's always sort of been like this anyway. You have these clubs, a lot of these clubs who come to be incredibly successful, incredibly huge levels of support, yet are funded by let's say unsavory individuals, or people who've got a little bit of a murky past, or people who carry out immoral business practices, and that's still the case. I mean, that's the case throughout football. It's the case throughout through the world economy. When we think about it, I mean, football is essentially mirroring what's going on in the world, and that is true. Then when you have nation states like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, coming in and buying these, I suppose they're cultural assets, aren't they? I mean, that's what they do. I mean, if Saudi Arabian states coming in, or the PIF, which we're led to believe isn't linked to the Saudi Arabian states, coming in and buying Newcastle United, and you're buying a huge fan base there. You're buying essentially the support of one of England's major cities, a club who've got a lot of potential. And it's that sort of stripping away of a cultural asset, and that's the same throughout the UK. I mean, in terms of the UK approach, Premier League almost embodies that, doesn't it? It's sort of like ultra capitalist approach, where it's like, well, as long as the money's coming in, like, it doesn't really matter. And I mean, I don't want to pick on any individual commentators, but whenever that takeover deal went through, and the game against Tottenham was on Sky Sports, it's this huge build up to it and all the excitement. I mean, listen, I get it. I get fans are excited, especially with the previous owner, Mike Ashley. I mean, we're talking about immoral business practices. This is a guy who ran a football club for all the wrong reasons, and had with what he runs, Sports Direct wasn't maybe, a lot of people take issue with that, but setting that aside, you've got a state coming in and a commentator is saying, these fans are so happy because they've won the ownership lottery.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of just think, well, okay, I get the excitement of getting money and sort of thinking, this is a little bit of fun. Like our team might be good again. But you just can't set aside everything else. I mean, it's not even the case that, this is a nation state in itself. I mean, I just don't think a nation state should own football clubs. I mean, that's just the principle. It doesn't matter if you're Saudi Arabia or a Western nation or wherever you're from. That just shouldn't happen. I always think that the Bundesliga model of the 50+1 voting rights in terms of what happens when a club. I mean, I think that should be widespread. But even setting that aside, you just can't think, right, this is a nation state that carries out systematic murders that is responsible for murdering Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist within recent years, that is hugely repressive to any sort of minority that doesn't follow the sort of conventional sort of Sharia law that's in place within the country.
Mm-hmm.
All these things are hugely problematic. And these are hugely problematic in a world sense beyond football, because Saudi Arabia obviously has a lot more investments than just in a football club, and a lot of fans that I've seen on social media are very keen about this sort of whataboutery. So like, why are you so upset that about Newcastle, but you'll use this taxi service or whatever else that has like investment, like they are partially invested. I said, I'm uncomfortable with that, but that's irrelevant, because what this is, I mean, we hear this term a lot. I use this term a lot, sports washing. Just sort of using this image to normalize a government or a nation's government, and coming and being like, don't talk about that. Talk about this. Talk about what we're doing here instead.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's very different. And it's not just a case of football. It's a case of in golf at the minute.
Mm-hmm.
Formula One, boxing, all these sports are being almost siphoned off in many ways, and it's interesting because those sports are different from football in the sense that the guys who are signing up to that, I mean, they're the individual sports players who are taking contracts almost directly from those nations, whereas in football it's the club, and by the club we're not talking about the supporters, we're not talking about the people who manage the club, we're talking about the suits, the executives, the people that nobody really sees, nobody really knows about. And the Newcastle takeover as well went beyond that, actually, because if you look at the sort of breakdown of what happened, there was very much a political interest within the British government to get that deal done. And Boris Johnson even saying in Parliament, he's raising the question of why has this not been sanctioned yet? Why the Premier League blocking this deal? And so sort of putting his foot in somewhere where it really shouldn't have been. And then you have the leaked emails that had come in from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to Boris Johnson to pressurise the government. And then Jamie Rubin being promoted to the Newcastle board, somebody who funded Boris Johnson's London mayoral campaign before he became Prime Minister. So you have all this is tied up, and I mean this is stuff that's hugely convoluted, and it can be very, very tiring and draining to keep on top of it all, and to sort of be, obviously you sort of feel like this is wrong, but it's like, well, what can you do? What can a Newcastle fan do? I mean, I know that there will be a very, very, very small minority whose relationship with the club will be fundamentally damaged by this. I mean, it will be. People have come out and said that, but it is a very, very small minority. I don't think fans should be expected to feel like that. But what I would say is that football fans should be aware of the issues. You should be like, well, Jamie Rubin might be donating all this money to food banks in Newcastle, but he's conversely funding a political party and a political campaign that has essentially been the cause of why those food banks were needed in the first place. But now all of a sudden he's hugely popular within that particular fan base because of how he has done that.
Sportswashing in full action.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. It's just a case of, well, he's connected to our football club, and hell has no fury like a football fan whose club has been scorned. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous. Like, it's just like to see how, like, and I mean, like, listen, we're all guilty of it. Like, everybody's guilty of it to a degree. You're just irrationally defensive of a club whereby, I get the idea of fandom. Fandom's great, but fandom can be terrible as well. And sports washing takes advantage of that. It manipulates people. It's designed to do this. So it's very hard to sort of moralize over supporters or anything like that, because it is difficult, and I don't envy the situation that they're in. But you don't have to defend it at every turn, and you should be aware of what has happened.
And I guess it feels like it's only going to continue, right? Because you've just spoken it there in terms of how well it does work for those who want it to work in terms of the sports washing. Because I can remember when the interest came from the Saudi Arabia fund to buy over Newcastle, and it seemed in the months leading up to it that there was maybe going to be a breaking point where it was too much scrutiny and it maybe wasn't going to go through, and it was whether the Premier League were going to sign off on it, and there was a lot of criticism and a lot of people speaking out about it. But then it went through. Months later, it seemed no one's really talking about it, and like you said, everyone's talking about the renewed spirit in the city of Newcastle, and you've got fans even wearing Arab-inspired clothing to games, and you've got some people from ownership group taking squad photos, and everyone's kind of rejoicing and celebrating in this new era of the club. And the scrutiny and the criticism that came before the ownership went through, it completely disappeared. So it feels like we're not anywhere close to kind of overcoming it or kind of solving it, and it gets to the point where, is there a solution, or are we just in this kind of environment where we need to accept it in a way? And if you think, because it's obviously well established now that engaging in these political, economic, or sporting relationship with regressive nations, be it Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, Russia, it obviously isn't helping them progress, or as much as we would want them to progress in our eyes. And so I'm wondering then, is there a solution or a new approach where we disengage? And if that is an approach, does that help at all? Is that an appropriate approach?
Yeah, and I think that's the key word, isn't it? Disengage, because that's what they want you to do. And it's interesting you mentioned Russia, because obviously Russia hosted the 2018 World Cup. And there was, when we talk about the Russian situation with Ukraine, but that didn't start this year. That started with the Donbass region. It was 7 or 8 years ago, and it obviously had actually longer implications than that. And there'll be people who are much better versed in that than me. But hosting the World Cup did not do anything for Russia as a nation to be progressive. That's some sort of word we're comfortable using in this sense, because it just doesn't. I mean, we always hear that as a defense. We always hear that. We're taking the World Cup to Qatar. We're going to take games to Saudi Arabia. But that's because we want to see these nations develop. We want to see more women involved with the game. We want to see greater rights for fans. It's like, well, that's just a load of nonsense. That's just not true. I mean, that's not the reason you're doing it. You're doing it for money. Just admit that you're doing it for money, because those things don't work. These sort of idealistic viewpoints don't happen in the sort of cold hard reality of things. And it's really interesting as well, because the Manchester City takeover happened in 2008. I mean, I was a bit too young to fully understand that. I was still in school, but you kind of think back to that time, and there certainly wasn't the level of, I wouldn't say furore is probably the wrong word to use, but that level of kind of pushback against that idea of a nation state coming in with a human rights record like the Arab Emirates, like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, coming in and taking over a club. It didn't really seem like there was, certainly compared to what it has been in the years since, like there was this big, this is something that we should be concerned about. Whereas now there's definitely a much greater awareness, I think, of these things happening. And obviously that's peaked with what's happening in Qatar with the Qatar World Cup. And there is also an argument that you can make whereby it's like, oh, the Qatar World Cup's trying to normalise Qatar and everything else. But what that has done is it has put the spotlight on Qatar for the past 10, 11, 12 years. And all this stuff is now getting exposed, whereby it might not have really been afforded the same level of exposure had they not have been hosting a World Cup. But because they are putting themselves center stage, that is the sort of spotlight that's shed in these things. And there's another example here, which is a much lower profile, but it's also quite relevant to sort of current events. That's Rwanda, and Rwanda has a dictatorship. Rwanda has human rights abuses by its government, which are on record as the UK is being concerned about. You also have the UK trying to deport migrants to Rwanda, and the irony of all this is that Arsenal and PSG have a 10 million a year sponsorship with the Rwandan Tourist Board, Visit Rwanda, encouraging people to go to Rwanda, whereby you actually have this dictatorship in place where you have people who are suppressed. And I did an interview with Colin Millar earlier this year for the Mirror about her dad, Paul Rusabini, who had been sort of arrested and detained illegally in Rwanda, and the film Hotel Rwanda was based on his actions during the Rwandan civil war of the genocide that went on there, and the sort of terrible history that they've had and they've had to endure. You have a government now that are doing all that, and yet are just sort of casually normalizing themselves by putting Visit Rwanda on Arsenal shirts, or Arsenal training gear, and PSG shirts. So I just think, I mean, even that's a different example, because that's not Qatar, that's not Saudi Arabia, that's not a state that has almost endless wealth. I mean, this is one of the most, I think it's the 20th most impoverished nation in the world. Yet they're given 10 million a year to these clubs who are owned by billionaires. Yeah. And it's such a strange thing. And I know there was an argument that, it's trying to promote their own tourist board, promote their own economy. And yet that is true, but they renewed the deals during COVID times whenever there was no international travel. And there's no evidence that actually will come to pass whereby it does boost the economy long term and makes that investment worthwhile. But what it definitely does do is that it normalizes Rwanda and the sort of exposure that nation gets and its government get within a sort of mainstream sporting normality. So that's another angle of this. But listen, there's so many things we can say about this. But one thing that I'm not sure if it's something to be hopeful about, but the situation with Russia this year and the subsequent sort of breaking in ties between the British government, I can guess you can say that the British government and a lot of Russian kleptocrats and oligarchs has seen Roman Abramovich obviously have to sell Chelsea, have to leave the club. And Roman Abramovich actually said this whenever he bought Chelsea. He's like, well, why have you come to London? Why have you bought a club? He's like, people don't talk about you. People aren't really interested in who you are or what you've done. But you've got a lot of money. You're investing in a club, and you're keeping a lot of people very happy. And that was it. That was essentially what happened for 2 decades. And that was almost like a masterclass in sports washing, because people weren't even aware it was sports washing. Roman Abramovich, he's not. If anybody had said there was a link between Abramovich and Vladimir Putin in any way, that you would have been liable. You would have been subject to a libel case if you had printed that. Yeah, the British government then this year actually confirmed that. They said that themselves, that there was now an indisputable link between the two. So now you can report that. Now you can say those things. And now he wasn't able to run Chelsea Football Club anymore. But nothing had actually changed with Abramovich. I mean, Abramovich didn't want the war. He's a huge loser out of this situation. He didn't want any of this. But because of the sort of geopolitical shift that there's been, that sort of relationship between Abramovich and British football had to be cut off. Maybe that will happen to Saudi Arabia. Maybe it will happen with any of these other nations that we've been talking about. It's very much dependent on sort of current affairs, current situation, and it isn't consistent at all.
Exactly.
There is no consistency here. It's just the whim of whoever is in power and what benefits them at that particular time.
No, yeah, exactly. I think that's what I react to is the blatant hypocrisy. And I understand, I totally recognize, and you mentioned that briefly. It is hard to stay equally engaged. It's impossible to stay equally engaged in every issue, and at a point there will become a whataboutery, right? Well, you care about that. What about this? And what about that? So you take on a massive task. In many ways, also the Abramovich disconnect then from Chelsea can be seen as a progress, while at the same time, months ahead, I've had Saudi Aramco be engaged with Newcastle. So it is tough, but it is what started with. It's the selective morality, right? That is of Arsenal collecting sponsorship money from Visit Rwanda, while at the same time saying Black Lives Matter, or not supporting us with the Uyghur Muslims. It's you can extend it to the NBA and Hong Kong, those all issues. So it's tough because I understand you are put under scrutiny and you cannot be equally engaged. But then it comes for me to a point where, are you better off not doing it at all? Because these clubs, it's so blatant to us. When Manchester City have the rainbow flag behind their profile on their Twitter, and it's on all their profiles except the one they have in the Muslim world, because the way it is homosexuality is illegal there. It just becomes problematic. What I cannot get my head around, and I think it will be tough for us to do so, is how it is able to carry on, and if there isn't any way of reversing it. And it does tie into what we have discussed in terms of money being the prevailing objective. But it's tough, and it's something that's hard for us to solve in this moment of time. But it's an interesting discussion to have, because at what point does it start and what point does it end?
Yeah, and it's football clubs, football leagues, football organizations are all businesses. Like we talk about this. We talk about these as sort of clubs and sport. We sort of think of it in our heads, or this is separate. This sort of belongs to us, like it belongs to everyone. And of course, on one hand, that's partially true, but in more realistic terms, it's not, because these are brands who will say what they think will resonate with people, what they think will increase their own revenue streams, what they think will allow them to grow as a business and as a brand. I mean, I don't like using those words, but like I don't think Manchester City are a brand, or Barcelona are a brand, but the way the people that run the club, they think like that because they have to think like that. And that's their job.
Yeah.
And they'll market themselves to a Western audience. We're LGBT plus friendly. We're incredibly progressive. Where we want everybody to feel welcome. We want And on the other hand, it's like, well, yeah, but you're literally run by a regime who doesn't afford those exact same rights to its own citizens. In fact, not only that, but if it actively doesn't do that, it's actively not doing that. So there's that huge contradiction there, and that's true. That's true throughout football. I don't want to pick on Manchester City because as you said, if you pick on one set of fans, they'll be like, well, but what about this and what about that? You sort of get drowned in all this sort of information. That it's like, yeah, but all these things aren't good. But there's only so many things you can say at one time. But it is true. It is true that they're not the only club who are like this. We can even maybe look at some of the broadcasters for the Premier League, who will say they promote these messages, and it's good of them to promote the messages. I think. I think this is great that these messages are getting the sort of airtime and the exposure. On one hand, of course that's true. That it's important, but then again, the flip side of that is then they'll be promoting the fact that these people have come into these clubs and just spending a lot of money without being like, well, actually, what they represent is the exact opposite of what you're saying should be promoted. The messages that you're trying to get across. And there's that contradiction, that constant contradiction that's at the heart of the sport, the heart of the clubs, the heart of the coverage of the sport, the heart of everything. And it is so difficult to really articulate it properly, isn't it? Been for any of us, because there's always more that you can say, and there's always more context, there's always more nuance, and it's just one of those things that it's incredibly difficult to contextualize in a better way than that. But I think that we just have to. I think it's important to continue to be aware of all these issues, and to be aware of the contradictions that are there, and to accept as well that these things work. Sportswashing does work. Sadly, I think it's true that it works. But on the other hand, there is, as I said, a greater pushback against it than ever before, and that sort of the dynamic that it creates. So it'll be interesting to see what exactly will happen from here. But as I said, these things are volatile. Situations can be volatile. Things can change quite quickly. Nobody would have thought in January that Roman Abramovich would not be the owner of Chelsea Football Club by March. Yet by March, that idea had been totally normalised. So these things do move quickly. World events change quickly, and football will forever be getting caught up in them and being mad in what's going on outside of it.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the questions also is if there's too much onus being put on, athletes, players, managers to kind of stand up or, answer to these kind of political and moral dilemmas. And I mean, you look at Pep Guardiola, who seems to be grilled the most about Man City's ownership and the fraudulent sponsorship allegations. You look at Eddie Howe, who was grilled, frequently about Newcastle's ownership. And like you said, it's Boris Johnson's encouraging the Premier League for that ownership to go through. You then look at the Russian money that has infiltrated the London economy and the Conservative Party in the UK. But it seems to be Chelsea that gets the most heat for having Ibrahimovic as their owner. Arsenal coming under heat and PSG for the visit to Rwanda, but then the UK government paying the Rwanda government millions of pounds to take on refugees. So it's almost, it's football, it's getting all the heat, and particularly the players and the managers, when it's loads above them, the owners, the politicians, the CEOs that are making the decisions. And I'm just wondering, how fair that is and how you get around that.
Well, in terms of fairness, I think the questions are fair. I think whenever Eddie Howe became Newcastle manager, he knew who he was going to be working for. He knew the source of the funds. He knew exactly what he was walking into, and he's getting the benefits of that. So if that's your employer and you're knowingly aware of it and you're knowingly benefiting from it, and the same with Pep Guardiola at Manchester City, it's the same elsewhere. You're the public face of the club. I mean, that's part of your job. You should be answerable. And of course, in an ideal world, you would have the people who are actually the CEOs or the people who are involved structurally with these deals answering for themselves. But they won't do that. They will only ever give interviews whenever it's essentially a PR release, comfortable questions. They're not going to get dragged in because they don't have to. But these guys are the public facing image of the club. What I would say about Pep Guardiola is that Pep Guardiola has obviously been a sort of staunch advocate of Catalonia and the situation of Catalan, I suppose, nationalism, potential separatism from Spain. And he has spoken of historic wrongs, even contemporary wrongs, you could argue. Yet, whenever he's pressed on the people he works for and what they do to their people, to their population, he doesn't seem to have the same concerns. Now that, for me, is an issue. That's a valid point to sort of bring up and to speak about. And probably even more blatantly was Xavi Hernandez, who obviously retired, playing career in Qatar, and became a manager in Qatar before going back to Barcelona this year. And he had a good time in Qatar. He won the national lottery, which was very transparently conducted, and he gave a series of interviews whereby he said how everybody loved living in Qatar, how great a life it was, how much better it was than living in Europe, how the Qatari government was better for its people than the Spanish government were for its people. Now, I'm not saying that the Spanish government is perfect, and I'm not saying that everybody can have their own opinions, but the Spanish government is a democracy. The Catalan people are not in any way suppressed by the Spanish government. I mean, that in this current day and age, to say something like that is blatantly ludicrous. It's incorrect. And what he is doing is exactly what the Qatari government would love him to do. It's amazing PR. I mean, that is exactly what they want. They couldn't have asked for him to give a better quote. They just couldn't. They couldn't have written it better themselves, because that's the image that a lot of these states want to give off. If any of us were to go over to Qatar or to Abu Dhabi or wherever else, you would be treated incredibly well because you're from Western Europe, because you're white, because you're seen to have a certain level of influence, a certain level of wealth. Whereas if you're from South Asia, you look at the reports of the number of deaths of South Asian migrants within Qatar in the build up to the World Cup, and just unexplained. Living in conditions, slave labour. I mean, it's, to think about it, it's actually quite harrowing what goes on, and the fact that your experience from somebody from the Western world in one of those countries is the polar opposite, and systematically so with somebody who's from South Asia, and that's a huge problem, and that's when it becomes problematic when you have somebody like Xavi from outside, not because he's somebody who carries huge influence. He's one of the greatest footballers of all time. I don't think anybody would dispute that, he's obviously incredibly intelligent. He's very articulate. He's now the manager of Barcelona. He could become a very successful manager. Let's see. But to come out with that was, I mean that actually happened years ago, and I still haven't fully gotten over it. I don't think anybody at that level can be compared to what he said on that issue, on the sort of system of governance and everything else, to go into that detail.
But do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important that they're asked on it.
But do you think? I've always wondered that. Do you think they think that, or is it because if we go? I don't want to go too psychologically here, but as humans, we always have to negotiate with ourselves. This sort of, I'm a good person, right? So we have to negotiate that. And what you're clearly emphasizing here, and which is clear to all of us, is, if you are for Catalonia, you're running counter to what you've said before, and you don't want to be, the last thing you want to be seen as is a hypocrite or to stand for two opposing views. But when and obviously you can't account for what they think, but I'm always wondering if they actually think that, or is it some sort of denial or a compartmentalization of thoughts? Because for us, they are decently smart people, even though footballers aren't known as that, but I will be here to say they will understand that is, it's counterintuitive, right? So I'm just wondering what if they actually think that or not. But I don't know. You cannot account for that. But I wonder be curious to see what your theory would be.
Yeah, it is curious. And listen, I don't want to be picking on Barcelona alumni or managers or star players. But Lionel Messi is another fantastic example. It's just because of what's happened recently. I mean, listen, he moved to Qatar. He moved to PSG or run by Qatar ahead of the World Cup, and listen, that's a PR move in itself. But fine, you get that. I mean, that's a football transfer. But then he took on a role for the Saudi Arabia Tourism Board in May, which is obviously going to earn him millions and millions and millions of euros or whatever, make him a lot richer than he already is. I mean, this is the richest footballer in the world. This is somebody who's got enough money to sustain several generations without ever having to make any more money. I mean, that's the level of wealth that he has. It's unthinkable. I mean, like the amount of wealth that he has is actually unthinkable to anyone else, really. Yet he still thought, I'm going to advertise for Saudi Arabia. I want to promote the country. That's a business move by me that I think is a good idea. And I was trying to sort of think, in what world, what was his thought process behind that? Because it doesn't make a difference to his wealth. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. It's money that will likely never be used, never be touched. Certainly not by him personally. Yeah, you kind of think, does it tarnish his image? I mean, it probably should, but will it actually have any real impact? Probably not. And then you get into that point where it's like, well, what really matters anymore? And Lionel Messi, like somebody who's invested a lot of money in a lot of very worthwhile causes, a lot of charities and everything else, and all that stuff's very admirable. Of course it is, but that's a separate topic. That doesn't explain why he's doing this. It doesn't. I can't come up with a satisfactory answer for that. No. Maybe I briefly worked, and I must stress, at a very low level of financial services before I moved into football journalism, and I was aware that people within that sort of field, like clients, I was like, the more money that people have, the more obsessed by it they become. In terms of they like, we've built this, like this is ours, and like the bigger it gets, the more you think about it. It's like a natural thought process in a way, and you become more protective of it, you become more worried about it, and you just become obsessed by it. And I kind of think, is that something that comes into play with even at this sort of totally different stratospheric level of wealth? It's like, well, earning more money. I mean, of course you should earn more money. This is an option you can make more money. And in your head, maybe you sort of justify it by, but this is going to be for my children and my grandchildren, even though like it doesn't really make a difference at all. But you sort of think like that. You sort of, maybe you just become into this way of thinking where just more money is a good thing, and that's pretty much all all you're concerned about. Because if Messi's advertising Saudi Arabia, the reality is it's probably not going to make any difference to anybody. It's probably not going to persuade more people to go there. But what it does do is it normalizes Saudi Arabia as being a possible destination, as being just a normal nation. But it's not a normal nation, and that's what you've got to keep stressing. And I guess maybe when you just get to a certain level of wealth, you just think differently, and maybe everyone else just can't understand it because we're not walking in their shoes. We don't know how it feels like. I don't feel sorry for them, but of course not. But at the same time, maybe they just live in almost like in a fantasy world whereby they think this is important when it's just not. And I don't know if I don't know if that's something that you can blame them for or sort of criticize them for, but it's certainly stuff that should be highlighted and should be questioned. I mean, those are entirely legitimate questions that they should be answerable for.
Yeah, absolutely. Colin, I want to get your take or your opinion on. There seems to be this kind of new environment, and it's particular correlation between politics and sport in the UK, especially, where there's this kind of increasing inequality between capital, labour, owners, workers, owners, fans of football clubs. Where money prevails all. There's a real lack of accountability and morality is being obscured. And to the point where mistakes that would have previously driven out politicians or owners are now being brushed aside and aren't as effective anymore. And you look at, Boris Johnson being the prime example. You look in a football context with the Glazers. I mean, the way they're running Man United and continue taking out dividends, the way the Super League came together and collapsed, and although there was a kind of outrage, there wasn't any changes in the infrastructure or ownership or any real kind of, changes from the protest. And it's wondering how this environment came about, and where does it go from here, sort of?
Yeah, I suppose the Super League example is really, really strong because I was just going to say that supporters are by and large powerless. I mean, there's very little. Obviously, on an individual level, there's no impact you can make. But maybe as a collective, there's a chance that you might make a small change. But the Super League was really interesting because the Super League, that moment was the fact when fans actually felt we're the ones who've got the power here. We can sort of come in and stop these bad things from happening, from developing. And it felt like that was the moment that you had to seize it for meaningful change. That was, you had the extra moment, like, right, this is whenever the structure of clubs needs to change, whereby fans get a voice. And I'm not saying fans need to own the club. Nobody was ever advocating that. But to have a voice, to have a say in what goes on, to have a stake, they don't have any of that. These owners aren't accountable whatsoever. They stage manage videos, if we're lucky, a lot of the time. And what happened from the Super League? Well, the Super League didn't happen. Fans said, no, we don't want that. And what's actually subsequently happened is that UEFA have just introduced changes to the Champions League, to the Europa League, whatever else, that are essentially what the Super League was doing. The only difference is that there's still some level of meritocracy in qualifying, but even that's been watered down because they've got, if you've got this coefficient of this ranking, you could still qualify anyway, even if you have a terrible campaign. So it's like even if you're a mass total failure, you'll still get in if you're rich. Essentially, that's what that does. UEFA have just taken the elements of the Super League and just packaged it up in a more palatable way because UEFA aren't new. It wasn't a PR disaster. They did it very gradually with what they brought in. They sort of demanded a little bit more and then scaled it back. But there's going to be more football games than ever, more meaningless football games than ever, more money being given towards the biggest clubs in Europe. And what has actually changed at a club level? What has changed for fans? I mean, maybe Manchester United fans might disagree a little bit because maybe they'll feel like there's a sense from their owners that they finally got them to the fans forum. They got sit down with them in that sense. There was some sort of concession, but these are the most small scale, meaningless concessions there are. I mean, like that, Manchester United are a great example because the Glazers are almost like these sort of, I suppose we can say, vulture capitalists who just sort of come in, buy the club essentially with their own money, plunge them into debt, and just aren't accountable at all. Let stadiums sort of decay, let standards slip, but we're not going to intervene at all. Just let our business people run the club.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's essentially what's happened. And accountability in football. We're talking about that sort of leverage buyout that happened to Burnley. And when did their takeover go through? Was it a year ago? Their takeover was maybe slightly more. And so that's happened 15 years after the Glazers takeover. Exactly the same thing, just on a much smaller scale. And now Burnley find themselves in potential financial Armageddon in the next year because they've got these incredible debts that they need to pay back to their owners who bought the club, and now they've been relegated and they don't have the income to pay it off. So these structures haven't been rectified to correct that. Within 15 years, it hasn't changed. And you always see these football league clubs who are being bought over by owners who should be absolutely nowhere near a club. They should not have that responsibility. The most recent example was Birmingham City and this guy Lawrence Bassini. I'm guessing most people haven't heard of him or aren't familiar with his background, but Watford fans will be familiar with him because of how he ran the club. He ran the club disastrously. He's put several businesses out of business. If you look at the track record of his career, it is one of ruin. Constant ruin, constant mismanagement, constant PR disaster passes. This is somebody who's on the verge of buying a football club again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, what? Like, I mean, you keep hearing these, what's it, fit and proper owner tests, and like, what are the tests? And then you think, well, we're going back to Newcastle United and the Saudi Arabian takeover, and we're being told, the PIS nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. They just repeat the lie, just repeat that line again and again, and that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
Just wait for it